Midnight, I invite you to accompany us on an exploration of one of the most unsettling cases ever documented in the American South's history. Before proceeding further, please take a moment to share in the comments your current location and the precise time you're hearing this narration. We're genuinely curious to know which places and what hours of day or night these recorded stories manage to reach. The year was 1840. 023, like a massive artery, the Mississippi River wound through the deep South, transporting not merely commercial goods but human cargo as well, men, women, and children whose existence held value only in monetary terms. Situated in Adams County, Mississippi, just east of Nat Shea, Willow Bend Plantation featured a grand house positioned on a gentle incline, its white pillars catching the sunlight while being surrounded by cotton fields that extended endlessly toward the horizon. 050, viewed from a distance, the scene seemed almost idyllic. Yet concealed beneath that exterior of southern refinement lay horrors that few would whisper about, let alone speak openly. Had it not been for documents uncovered during 1962 renovations of the Nat Shea Courthouse, the story of Willow Bend Plantation and its mistress, Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood, might have remained forever buried within forgotten testimonies and county records. 116, behind an old filing cabinet being removed from a basement storage area, construction workers discovered a sealed wooden box. Inside this container rested court records, personal journals, and official correspondence dating from the 1840s, all pertaining to a case sufficiently disturbing that authorities promptly resealed the documentation, which remained hidden until a doctoral student researching antebellum trade practices rediscovered them 5 years later. 143. The wooden container itself bore the inscription Blackwood case not to be opened by order of Judge M. Lancaster, 1844. This deliberate attempt to physically inter the documentation reveals how profoundly the case troubled even individuals hardened by the brutal realities characterizing the antebellum South. That these records weren't simply destroyed suggests the conflicted conscience of those involved, individuals unable to confront the truth yet unwilling to completely erase it. 214. Court records dated November 1843 reveal that Eleanor Blackwood hadn't been born into plantation wealth. She arrived in Nat Shea from Philadelphia in 1832 as a young widow possessing a modest inheritance and a striking appearance. Contemporary descriptions portray her as tall and slender with piercing blue eyes and an unusual intensity present in her gaze. 237. The Philadelphia Directory of 1830 identifies her as Eleanor Kavanaugh, widow of merchant James Kavanaugh. His obituary in the Philadelphia Gazette noted his sudden passing from an unknown fever, though whispers trailed Eleanor suggesting circumstances might have been less than natural. Records from St. 301, Mary's Parish in Philadelphia indicate that Eleanor and James had been married merely 3 years before his death. The couple remained childless. Following James' death, their Walnut Street home was sold shortly afterward, with the transaction recorded in city property records on March 17, 1831. Notably absent from any Philadelphia documentation is evidence of Eleanor's existence prior to her marriage. 325. No birth records exist, no family connections appear, no social registers or church membership lists mention her before she emerged as James Kavanaugh's wife in 1828. This absence prompted questions from later investigators. Dr. Margaret Porter, whose research ultimately brought the Blackwood case to academic attention, dedicated months attempting unsuccessfully to trace Eleanor's origins. 350. As Porter observed in her research journals, Eleanor Kavanaugh seems to have materialized fully formed at approximately age 25 with no history whatsoever and without any family connections. This pattern of suddenly appearing within a community with a fabricated or concealed history would repeat when she reached Nat Shea. No formal inquiry into James Kavanaugh's death ever occurred, and Eleanor departed Philadelphia with her inheritance shortly after concluding her husband's affairs. For 24, the estate executor, attorney William Harrison, later recalled Eleanor displaying unusual composure throughout probate proceedings and appearing primarily concerned with liquidating assets as rapidly as possible. Harrison's private correspondence, discovered within a collection donated to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1902, expressed reservations about the speed with which Eleanor sought to convert her inheritance into cash, though he noted lacking any legal basis to delay the process. 456, her arrival in Nat Shea occurred during what historians now term the peak of the flush times, a period marked by extraordinary economic expansion driven by cotton cultivation and the forced migration of enslaved individuals to the Deep South. During the 1830s, cotton production in Mississippi increased by over 800%, generating unprecedented wealth for plantation proprietors. 522, this economic boom rested upon the labor of enslaved people, whose numbers in Mississippi rose from approximately 33,000 in 1800 to over 195,000 by 1840. Nat Shea in 1832 presented a city of sharp contrasts. The elegant mansions atop the bluff overlooked the infamous Natchez Under the Hill, a waterfront district featuring gambling establishments, brothels, and slave pens where human beings were confined before auction. 552, this was a place where immense wealth and unconscionable brutality coexisted, each facilitating the other. The Nat Shea Courier from that period contains advertisements for slave auctions positioned alongside notices for elegant balls and musical performances, a cognitive dissonance characterizing a society that viewed itself as civilized while engaging in the purchase and sale of human beings. 617, Eleanor registered at the Mansion House Hotel on October 12, 1832. According to the hotel's guest book preserved within the Nat Shea Historical Society collection, she indicated Philadelphia as her place of origin but offered no additional details about herself. The hotel manager, Thomas Wilkinson, later recalled that she prepaid 3 months' lodging with gold coins and requested the hotel's finest suite, explaining her intention to establish herself within Nat Shea society before acquiring a permanent residence. 652, Eleanor quickly attracted the attention of Henry Blackwood, a widower 20 years her senior who owned one of the county's most profitable cotton plantations. Contemporary accounts from Nat Shea Society columns note that Eleanor appeared remarkably composed for a recent widow, displaying none of the extended mourning customary for that era. 714, she attended social functions at Concord, the mansion of Spanish-born planter Manuel Gioso, where she first encountered Henry Blackwood in August 1832. What drew Henry to Eleanor remains speculative. The few surviving letters between them preserved within the Blackwood family papers suggest he was initially captivated by her beauty and apparent sophistication. 739, in one letter dated November 1832, he wrote, "Your familiarity with literature and music distinguishes you from the typical society lady. I find refreshing your willingness to express opinions on matters extending beyond household management. There exists a strength in your character reminiscent of my late mother, who helped establish our family in this wilderness when it remained Spanish territory." 803, Henry had lost his first wife Caroline to yellow fever 5 years earlier. Plantation ledgers indicate that following Caroline's death, Willowbend's productivity declined substantially. Neighbors reported that Henry had become withdrawn and neglectful of his business affairs. His longtime friend, Judge Martin Lancaster, wrote in his journal that Henry had lost the vigor that once made him one of our county's most successful planters. 832, he moves through existence like a man sleepwalking, maintaining the outward appearance of normalcy while the spirit within has dimmed. Henry's sudden interest in the striking northern widow raised eyebrows among Nat Shea society, but his family's long-established position within the community silenced most public criticism. 854, the Blackwoods ranked among the first American families to settle in the region after Spain ceded the territory to the United States in 1795. Henry's father, Colonel James Blackwood, had served alongside Andrew Jackson during the War of 1812 and leveraged his military connections to acquire substantial land grants. By the time of Henry's birth in 1787, the family was already established among the region's planter elite. 921, their courtship proved brief. By December 1832, the Nat Shea Courier announced their engagement. The announcement mentioned Eleanor's status as the widow of James Cavanaugh, a respected Philadelphia merchant, but provided no information regarding her family background. Their wedding in the spring of 1833 drew attendance from the region's most prominent families, including the Surgetts, the Miners, and the Dunbars, names that dominated the economic and political landscape of the area. 953, the ceremony took place at St. Mary's Cathedral in Nat Shea with Bishop John Joseph Chanchay officiating. The wedding register, still preserved in the cathedral archives, shows that Eleanor listed her parents as John and Mary Smith of Boston, names so generic as to suggest fabrication. No relatives of the bride attended the ceremony, Eleanor explaining that her family had been lost to a fever epidemic, a common enough occurrence in that era to avoid questioning. 1027, Eleanor transformed from a northern outsider to mistress of Willowbend Plantation with remarkable speed. The transition appeared too smooth to some observers. Sarah Dunbar wrote in her private correspondence, preserved in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, "The new Mrs. Blackwood commands the household as though born to it." 1049, one would never suspect she was not raised with servants at her beck and call. There exists something unnatural in how readily she has taken to issuing orders. Willowbend Plantation in 1833 consisted of 1,200 acres of prime cotton land stretching eastward from the Mississippi River's banks approximately 7 miles northeast of Nat Shea. 1113, the main house, constructed in 1816, was a two-story structure in the federal style featuring 6 columns across the front portico and a central hallway extending the length of the house on both floors. Unlike the more elaborate mansions closer to Nat Shea, Willowbend was designed for function rather than ostentation, the home of a working planter rather than a showpiece for social display. 1139, the plantation complex included the main house, a separate kitchen building, smokehouse, overseer's cottage, stable, blacksmith shop, cotton gin house, and quarters for the enslaved population. These quarters consisted of 24 crude cabins arranged in 2 rows approximately 300 yards from the main house, close enough for supervision but sufficiently distant to provide the white family privacy and separation from the sights and sounds of those whose labor generated their wealth. 1210, for the first several years, life at Willowbend appeared unremarkable compared to other plantations of the era. The 1835 agricultural census recorded 78 enslaved people working Willowbend's 1,200 acres, producing 480 bales of cotton annually, output consistent with plantations of similar size. 1233, Henry Blackwood continued managing agricultural operations while Eleanor oversaw the household according to the gender divisions typical of the time. Visitors to Willowbend during this period described it as a well-ordered plantation with no obvious signs of unusual cruelty. David Harrison, a cotton factor from New Orleans who visited Willowbend on business in 1836, wrote to his partner, "Blackwood runs a tight operation. 1 p.m., his fields are well tended, his gin in good repair, and his people appear adequately fed and clothed for their station. Mrs. Blackwood keeps an excellent table and manages the household with notable efficiency. What neighbors and plantation visitors could not have known was what occurred behind closed doors." 1321, according to testimony later given by house servants, Eleanor showed immediate and unusual interest in managing the enslaved people on the plantation, something generally delegated to overseers or the master himself. Martha, a house servant who had been at Willowbend since Henry's first marriage, later testified that Eleanor frequently visited the slave quarters at unusual hours, examining the enslaved people like she was taking inventory at a shop. 1353, Martha's testimony taken during the subsequent investigation stated, "Miss Eleanor would come to the quarters after dark sometimes with Mr. Rankin later on. They'd walk up and down the rows looking in the cabins, asking strange questions about who was strongest, who had the most meat on their bones. She talked about people like they was cattle, which I know ain't unusual for white folks, but there was something different in how she looked at them, like she was seeing something else." 1421, most disturbing were her visits to the plantation kitchen. The cook, an enslaved woman named Josephine who had served the Blackwood family for nearly 20 years, reported that Eleanor spent hours observing her butcher animals and prepare meats. According to Josephine's testimony, preserved in court records, she wanted to know everything about cutting flesh, which parts were tender, which were tough, how to cure different cuts, things no mistress ever asked before. 1450, Josephine recalled one particular incident that seemed significant in retrospect. "One day I was preparing a hog for smoking and Miss Eleanor watched the whole process, asking about every cut, every piece. Then she said something I never forgot. She said, 'All flesh is remarkably similar when you study it closely enough.' 1511, the way she said it made my skin crawl, though I didn't understand why at the time." By 1837, Henry Blackwood's health began declining. The plantation physician, Dr. James Wilkins, diagnosed a general failure of constitution, likely what modern medicine would identify as heart failure. His medical journals, discovered among his papers after his death in 1862, noted increasingly frequent visits to Willowbend throughout 1837 and 1838. 1543, Wilkins recorded administering laudanum for pain and prescribing bed rest but acknowledged the limitations of medical science at the time. Mr. Blackwood's condition continues to deteriorate despite all conventional treatments. His heart labors visibly, and fluid gathers in his extremities. I fear the end approaches, though his wife assures me she has been administering the prescribed medications faithfully. 1610, increasingly confined to his bedroom on the second floor of the main house, Henry delegated more responsibility to Eleanor. Plantation account books show that she took control of household finances in March 1837, an unusual step even for plantations where the mistress had significant responsibilities. 1630, most telling was her signature replacing Henry's on receipts for slave purchases, a domain almost exclusively managed by men in plantation society. During this period, Eleanor began attending slave auctions in Nat Shay and occasionally traveling as far as New Orleans to purchase enslaved people, an unusual practice for a plantation mistress at that time. 1655, most plantation purchases were handled by the master or overseer. The few women who did attend auctions typically did so to purchase house servants and were almost always accompanied by male relatives or business associates. Eleanor, however, attended alone. Records from the forks of the road market in Nat Shay show she first appeared there in July 1837. 1718, Isaac Franklin, one of the market's principal traders, noted in his business correspondence, Mrs. Blackwood examines the merchandise with unusual thoroughness. Most ladies find the process distasteful and leave selections to their husbands, but she inspects each item as carefully as any experienced planter. 1741, Franklin's choice of words, referring to human beings as merchandise and items, reflects the dehumanization inherent in the slave trade. Yet, even within this dehumanizing system, Eleanor's behavior stood out as sufficiently unusual to merit comment. Another trader, Samuel Townsend, wrote to his partner in Virginia, "The Blackwood woman drives a hard bargain." 1804, she knows exactly what she wants and won't pay $1 more than her determined price. Only buys prime males, aged 16 to 25, and examines their teeth and muscles like she was buying racehorses. What made her purchases notable, according to multiple auction records preserved in the Nat Shay Historical Society's archives, was her specific interest in enslaved men between the ages of 16 and 25. 1833, over the course of 18 months, Eleanor purchased 14 young men, paying premium prices for those in particularly good physical condition. These young men would arrive at Willowbend but would rarely be seen working in the fields alongside other laborers. Auction records show she paid $1,200 for an enslaved man named Isaiah in September 1837. 1855, a price well above the market average for field hands. The receipt described him as age 19. Exceptional physical specimen, sound teeth, no visible scars. A month later, she purchased 2 more young men from different traders, both described in similar terms and commanding premium prices. By December 1837, she had acquired 5 young men, none of whom were ever recorded in Willowbend's field labor assignments. 1924, household staff later testified that these men were kept in a separate cabin near the main house, ostensibly for special duties. Their work appeared light compared to field hands. They maintained the grounds immediately surrounding the main house, tended the kitchen garden, and performed various household repairs. 1944, several house servants noted that these men seemed to receive better food and clothing than other enslaved people on the plantation. Martha testified, "They ate better than the rest of us, got new clothes when they arrived, but they looked scared all the time. Wouldn't talk much even when no white folks were around, and then one by one they'd disappear." 2006, Miss Eleanor would say they were sold off or sent to work on another property, but no one ever saw them leave. As Henry's health deteriorated further, Eleanor's control over plantation operations expanded. The overseer's log from February 1838 notes, "Mrs. Blackwood now determines all work assignments and disciplinary measures." Mr. 2029, Blackwood no longer reviews the books or gives instructions regarding plantation management. By summer 1838, Henry rarely left his bedroom, and visitors to Willowbend were routinely told he was too ill to receive them. Dr. Wilkins's journals record increasing concern about Henry's condition during this period. Mr. 2052, Blackwood continues to weaken despite all treatments. Most troubling is the progressive confusion of his mind. He often fails to recognize longtime acquaintances and becomes agitated when discussing plantation business. Mrs. Blackwood reports he sometimes wakes in terror, claiming his food has been tainted, and refuses to eat unless she personally tastes each dish first. 2118, a paranoia I attribute to the effects of advancing heart failure on the brain. Henry Blackwood died in the summer of 1839, leaving Eleanor in full control of Willowbend Plantation. The Adams County probate records show he left everything to his wife, having no children from either of his marriages. The will, dated March 1838 and witnessed by Dr. 2140, Wilkins and Judge Lancaster, was remarkably brief and contained none of the specific bequests to relatives or longtime servants common in such documents. This simplicity raised no suspicions at the time but would later be scrutinized when questions arose about Eleanor's influence over her declining husband. The funeral was held at St. 2202, Mary's Cathedral, with Bishop Chanchay again officiating. The Natchez Courier reported that all the principal families of the county attended, though the article noted the absence of William Blackwood, Henry's younger brother from Virginia, who was unable to travel at this time but conveyed his sincere condolences. The burial took place in the Blackwood family plot at the Natchez City Cemetery, where Henry was laid to rest beside his first wife and his parents. 2233, with Henry's death, Eleanor's behavior reportedly changed. She dismissed the longtime overseer, Jeremiah Collins, who had managed Willowbend's agricultural operations for over 15 years, and hired Thomas Rankin, a man with a reputation for brutality who had previously been dismissed from 2 other plantations for excessive cruelty. 2256, Collins later told investigators, "I knew something wasn't right when she let me go." Said she wanted someone who wouldn't question her methods. Rankin had a bad name among decent planters, known for working people to death if it got a few more cotton bales. No Christian master would hire such a man, but she sought him out special. 2316, Rankin's previous employer, James Surgett of Clifton Plantation, had dismissed him after discovering he had beaten an enslaved man to death for dropping a bale of cotton. Surgett, while comfortable with the routine violence of the plantation system, recognized that killing valuable property was bad business. In his plantation journal, Surgett wrote, "Discharged Rankin today for excessive violence, resulting in the death of a prime field hand valued at $1,000. 2346, such waste cannot be tolerated regardless of the need for discipline." Eleanor not only hired Rankin despite his reputation but gave him unusual authority over the special enslaved men she had purchased. According to testimony from other plantation staff, Rankin and Eleanor would often meet privately in the library after the household had retired for the night, their conversations continuing until well past midnight. 2400 hours 14, Martha reported overhearing fragments of these conversations through the door while completing her evening duties. They talked about processing and yields like they was discussing the cotton crop, but something in their voices told me they was talking about people. The first disappearance occurred 3 months after Henry's death. 2400 hours 32, an enslaved man named Samuel, purchased just weeks earlier at the Forks of the Road slave market in Natchez, was present during the evening meal service but absent the following morning. When questioned by other house servants, Eleanor stated simply that he had been sold to a plantation further south. 2400 hours 51, no record of such a sale was ever found. The kitchen apprentice, a young woman named Lily, later testified that she had seen Samuel enter the kitchen house with Rankin around midnight. "Mr. Rankin told me to go back to my cabin, that Miss Eleanor needed the kitchen for special work. I saw Samuel standing there looking scared." 25:12, that was the last anyone saw him. Over the next 8 months, 5 more young men disappeared from Willowbend. Each time, Eleanor provided the same explanation: they had been sold. Yet, no neighboring plantations reported purchasing men from Willowbend, and no records of these transactions appeared in county ledgers where such sales were typically registered for tax purposes. 25:36 What made these disappearances particularly suspicious in retrospect was that they violated basic economic sense. Eleanor had paid premium prices for these men, in some cases as much as $1,500, a substantial investment. To sell them after only weeks or months of service would represent a significant financial loss, as no buyer would pay full price for an enslaved person without a proven work history or known skills. 26:05 As Judge Lancaster would later observe during the investigation, even if one sets aside all moral considerations, Mrs. Blackwood's explanation makes no business sense. These transactions, had they actually occurred, would have represented a ruinous financial strategy. During this period, Eleanor's dinner parties became renowned in Nat Shea society. 26:29 The Nat Shea Free Trader social column mentioned her gatherings several times, noting the exceptional quality of Mrs. Blackwood's table and her unique and flavorful dishes not commonly found in even the finest homes of the region. She became known for serving what she called special reserve meats, which she claimed were imported from various exotic locations. 26:55 Robert Jenkins, owner of a neighboring plantation, wrote in his journal in February 1840, "Dined at Willowbend last evening. Mrs. Blackwood served a roast she claimed was a rare breed of wild boar from Spanish territories. I have hunted game all my life and never tasted anything similar." When pressed for her supplier, she merely smiled and said her sources were a closely guarded secret. 27:19 Catherine Surgett recorded a similar experience in her diary. Eleanor's table continues to be the most interesting in the county. Last night she served a stew of remarkable tenderness, claiming it contained venison fed on a special diet of berries and herbs to enhance the flavor. I must confess, I have never encountered meat with quite the same quality. 27:43 Eleanor takes unusual pride in these dishes, watching her guests' reactions with an intensity that borders on impropriety. The events that eventually exposed the truth began with the arrival of Eleanor's brother-in-law, William Blackwood, in April 1840. William had been unable to attend his brother's funeral due to his wife's illness but traveled to Mississippi as soon as family obligations permitted. 28:06 According to his correspondence with Judge Lancaster, he intended to review his brother's estate and ensure that Henry's affairs had been properly settled. While the will left everything to Eleanor, William expressed concern about several longtime family servants who had been promised care in their old age. William arrived at Willowbend on April 17, 1840, planning to stay for several weeks. 28:32 According to his journal discovered among his personal effects after his death in 1858, he was immediately struck by the peculiar atmosphere of dread that seemed to permeate the plantation. William wrote, "The house servants move with unusual quietness, eyes downcast, speaking only when directly addressed. The field hands glimpsed from a distance labor with a mechanical quality that suggests not just the ordinary burden of forced work, but a deeper terror." 29:03 When I inquired after several young men I recalled from my last visit 2 years ago, Eleanor provided vague accounts of sales to other plantations. Something in her manner strikes me as false. William noted other troubling changes at Willowbend. The plantation, once known for its orderly management, now showed signs of neglect everywhere except the immediate vicinity of the main house. 29:27 Fields were overgrown in places, equipment sat unrepaired, and buildings needed maintenance. Most concerning to William was the condition of the enslaved population. The people appear underfed and work in a state of palpable fear. I observed fresh whipping scars on several individuals, including women, a practice my brother always condemned as unnecessary cruelty. 29:53 During his second night at Willowbend, William was awakened by sounds coming from the kitchen house, a separate building connected to the main house by a covered walkway, as was common in southern architecture of the period. Thinking it might be a thief, he took his pistol and made his way quietly toward the noise. What William witnessed that night was recorded in his journal in careful measured language that betrays his horror. 30:21 He described finding Eleanor and Rankin in the kitchen. On the large preparation table lay the body of a young man William had seen working in the stables earlier that day. According to William's account, The man's throat had been cut, and Eleanor was engaged in the butchering of the corpse as one might dress a deer or hog. William's journal entry describes his immediate reaction as paralysis of both body and mind, leaving him frozen in the shadows of the doorway. 30:51, he watched as Eleanor methodically separated portions of the man's body, wrapping certain cuts in cheesecloth while discarding others in a pail. All the while, she spoke to Rankin in what William described as a tone one might use when discussing the weather or crop yields. Most disturbing to William was Eleanor's evident expertise. 31:12, she wielded the knives with practiced precision, he wrote, explaining to Rankin which portions would be cured for future use and which would be prepared for tomorrow's dinner. She spoke of marbling and tenderness as a butcher might discuss prize cattle. There was no hint of moral comprehension in her manner, no suggestion that she viewed her actions as anything but ordinary household management. 31:39, William's account continues. Most horrifying was her casual reference to previous specimens, comparing the quality of this man's flesh to others she had processed. She instructed Rankin on improvements to their selection criteria, suggesting they look for individuals with specific dietary habits that might enhance flavor. 32:03, I remained frozen in place, unable to intervene or even to flee, as though witnessing something so monstrous that my mind could not formulate a response. Eventually, William managed to retreat undetected to his room. He barricaded the door with a chest of drawers and spent the remainder of the night in sleepless terror, debating what action to take. 32:25, his journal reflects his moral struggle. To whom does one report such an abomination? What authority exists to address a crime so far beyond the boundaries of civilized comprehension? And would any official in this county take action against a wealthy widow on the word of an outsider when the victims are considered mere property under law? 32:51, at breakfast, Eleanor appeared as composed as ever, inquiring about his plans for the day and suggesting a ride to view the eastern fields where the cotton was just beginning to show. William noted she served ham at breakfast, commenting on its exceptional quality. I could not bring myself to touch it, or indeed any food on the table. 33:12, she noticed my lack of appetite but seemed to find it merely amusing, remarking that the southern heat often affects northern constitutions. Rather than confronting Eleanor directly, William made an excuse about urgent business in Natshay and left Willowbend immediately. He went directly to the home of Judge Martin Lancaster, a family friend, where he related what he had witnessed. 33:36, the judge, initially skeptical, nonetheless agreed to accompany William back to Willowbend with the local sheriff. Judge Lancaster's private papers, donated to the Mississippi Historical Society in 1890, record his initial disbelief. Mr. Blackwood's account seemed so fantastic as to suggest a mind unhinged by grief or illness. 34:02, yet I have known him for 20 years as a man of sound judgment and impeccable character. The gravity of the accusation, however implausible, demanded investigation. Lancaster's journal continues, I confess I expected to find nothing amiss at Willowbend. The very nature of the alleged crime seemed beyond belief, not merely murder, which occurs even in the best societies, but an act of such depravity that the mind resists acknowledging its possibility. 34:33, I agreed to accompany William primarily to assuage his obvious distress and to demonstrate the impossibility of his claims. When they arrived later that afternoon, they found Eleanor hosting a tea for several neighboring plantation mistresses. She received the unexpected visitors graciously, showing no sign of concern when the sheriff requested to inspect the kitchen and outbuildings. 34:56, according to Sheriff Thomas Wilkinson's official report, Mrs. Blackwood displayed no anxiety at our arrival or our request. She instructed her house servant to show us wherever we wished to go, while she remained with her guests. The kitchen revealed nothing unusual upon initial inspection. It had been thoroughly cleaned with no sign of the previous night's activities. 35:21, however, when the sheriff's deputy moved a large barrel in the smokehouse adjacent to the kitchen, they discovered a small trapdoor in the floor. Beneath it was a cellar not included in the original construction plans of the plantation, containing smoking hooks, various knives, and a large copper rendering pot. The soil floor of the cellar showed dark stains that the sheriff would later testify could only be blood and in such quantity as to suggest repeated use. 35:52, in his report, Sheriff Wilkinson wrote, "Upon discovering the hidden cellar, I instructed Deputy Collins to expand our search to all outbuildings. Mrs. Blackwood's guests had departed by this time, and I informed her of our findings. She showed remarkable composure, claiming the cellar was used for curing special game meats and that the renovations had been completed at her instruction shortly after her husband's death." 36:21, a search of the root cellar in the main house revealed preserved meat in jars that Eleanor claimed was venison and pork. The discovery that ultimately confirmed William's accusations came in Eleanor's private study, a leather-bound ledger with meticulous records of the young men she had purchased, including their physical attributes, purchase prices, and dates. 36:45, next to each name was a notation indicating processing date and yield. The ledger contained coldly clinical assessments. Subject J, purchased May 3, 1839, processed May 18, yield, 142 pounds usable product. Notes, excessive fat marbling in shoulder cuts. Diet modification recommended for future subjects to improve quality. 37:10, most horrifying of all were the subsequent entries showing dates when Eleanor had served dinner parties to neighboring planters and business associates from Nat Shea. The ledger included notes about which cuts were served to which guests, along with Eleanor's observations on the quality and flavor of different individuals. Sheriff Wilkinson's report describes his reaction to this evidence. 37:35, I have served in law enforcement for 22 years and witnessed numerous atrocities. Yet nothing in my experience prepared me for the cold precision of Mrs. Blackwood's records. The methodical documentation suggested not just multiple murders, but a sustained enterprise of the most depraved nature imaginable. By this time, Eleanor's guests had departed, and she was confronted with the evidence. 38:01, according to the sheriff's written statement, she simply said, "Why do you look so shocked? Property is property. I simply found a more efficient use for mine." She made no attempt to flee or resist arrest. As she was escorted from Willowbend, she allegedly turned to William and remarked, "Your brother understood the value of innovation in plantation management. 38:25, he would have appreciated my improvements to the household economy." The investigation that followed revealed the full extent of Eleanor's activities. In addition to the hidden cellar beneath the smokehouse, investigators discovered a second concealed space beneath the floor of a storage shed near the slave quarters. 38:45, this space contained personal items belonging to the missing men, small trinkets, pieces of clothing, a hand-carved wooden figure suggesting Eleanor had kept souvenirs of her victims. Dr. Wilkins, upon being shown the evidence, recounted a disturbing conversation with Eleanor during Henry's illness. Mrs. Blackwood once inquired about the similarities between human anatomy and that of livestock. 39:10, I assumed it was idle curiosity stemming from her oversight of the plantation's butchering operations. Now I must consider whether she was already contemplating these monstrous acts even while her husband lived. Interviews with the plantation's enslaved population revealed a climate of extreme terror. Many reported being threatened with going to the kitchen if they failed to perform their duties adequately. 39:38, Martha, the house servant who had testified about Eleanor's unusual interest in the enslaved people, told investigators, "We all knew something terrible happened to those boys, but nobody dared speak of it. Miss Eleanor said anyone who spread tales would be next." Josephine, the cook, revealed that she had been removed from her duties in the kitchen during the nights when the disappearances occurred. 40:02, Miss Eleanor would tell me to leave everything prepared, but not to return until morning. The kitchen would be clean when I came back, too clean, like they'd scrubbed every surface, and there'd be new meat in the smokehouse that I hadn't prepared. The plantation's financial records, when examined by county officials, showed another disturbing pattern. 40:22, Eleanor had significantly reduced food purchases for the plantation while maintaining the same number of enslaved people. Investigators estimated she had cut food costs by nearly 20% over 18 months, savings apparently achieved by her macabre efficiency. Judge Lancaster noted in his personal journal, The economic implications of Mrs. 40:45, Blackwood's actions represent a grotesque extension of the plantation system's logic. By converting human property from labor to consumption, she eliminated the costs of maintaining workers while extracting a different form of value. The cold calculation evident in her records suggests not merely murderous impulses, but a perverted business model. 41:09, perhaps most disturbing were the testimonies from guests who had dined at Willowbend. Eleanor had been known for hosting elaborate dinner parties featuring what she called special reserve meats prepared according to her personal recipes. She often told guests they were dining on exotic game meats imported at great expense. 41:32, the realization of what they had actually consumed caused several witnesses to become physically ill during the trial. Catherine Surgett, upon learning the truth, suffered a nervous collapse that required months of recuperation. Her husband, James Surgett, wrote to Judge Lancaster, "My wife cannot bear to take food since the revelation of what occurred at Willowbend." 41:55, the thought that she unknowingly participated in such an abomination has shattered her health and peace of mind. I fear she may never fully recover from this shock. Robert Jenkins, who had praised Eleanor's wild boar in his journal, attempted suicide upon learning what he had actually consumed. His physician, Dr. Samuel Thompson, reported that Jenkins had become convinced he was contaminated beyond redemption and required constant supervision to prevent self-harm. 42:27, the psychological impact on the Natchez community extended beyond those who had dined at Willowbend. Many families who had socialized with Eleanor reported feelings of shame and complicity despite having no knowledge of her crimes. Church attendance in Natchez reportedly doubled in the weeks following the revelations, as citizens sought spiritual cleansing from what many perceived as a collective sin that had occurred in their midst. 42:55, Judge Lancaster recorded in his papers, "I have presided over cases of murder, arson, and the most brutal assaults. Yet never have I seen an entire courtroom collectively shudder as when Mrs. Blackwood's dinner menus were read into evidence. Several ladies had to be escorted from the proceedings, and even hardened men of law and medicine turned pale." 43:17, the trial of Eleanor Blackwood began in September 1840 and lasted only 3 days. The evidence was overwhelming, and she was found guilty not of murder, as killing an enslaved person was rarely prosecuted as such in that era, but of destruction of property and fraud for serving human flesh to unwitting guests. This legal paradox, that the courts recognized the horror of her actions but could only prosecute them through the lens of property crime, highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the slave system itself. 43:54, as one newspaper editorial from the Northern Abolitionist Press noted, the Blackwood case lays bare the ultimate logic of human chattel. If a person can be property, then property can be butchered. The courts of Mississippi are not appalled that humans were killed, but that investments were squandered. 44:14, William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, a prominent abolitionist newspaper, featured the case prominently in its October 1840 edition. The editorial argued, "What distinguishes Mrs. Blackwood from any other slave owner is merely the form of exploitation she chose. All slaveholders consume human lives for profit. She simply did so more literally than most." 44:37, the system that permits one permits the other. Southern newspapers largely avoided detailed coverage of the case. The Natchez Courier mentioned the trial only briefly, noting that Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood has been convicted of serious crimes against property and public decency without specifying the nature of these crimes. 45:00, the deliberate vagueness suggests a desire to minimize public awareness of a case that raised uncomfortable questions about the institution of slavery itself. The sentencing, however, revealed the complex moral failings of the time. Because Eleanor's victims were legally considered property rather than persons, the court sentenced her primarily for the financial damage to the investment of the plantation. 45:25, she was committed to the Mississippi State Asylum in Jackson, not primarily for her murders, but because, as the judge stated, no sane woman of breeding could commit such acts. Judge Lancaster's sentencing statement preserved in court records reflects this contradiction. The court finds itself in an unprecedented position. 45:48, The laws of our state provide clear penalties for the destruction of property, which has occurred in this case to a substantial degree. Yet the nature of these acts suggests a derangement of mind that places them beyond the reach of ordinary justice. This court therefore commits Mrs. Eleanor Blackwood to the state asylum for the remainder of her natural life, both as punishment for her crimes and for the protection of society from further similar acts. 46:17, the asylum superintendent, Dr. William Langley, kept detailed records of his interactions with Eleanor. These records, preserved in the state archives, provide disturbing insights into her mindset. Dr. Langley wrote in December 1840, "Patient shows no signs of conventional insanity. She is lucid, articulate, and capable of rational conversation on most topics." 46:41, it is only when discussing her crimes that her moral derangement becomes apparent. She cannot be made to understand why her actions were wrong. Langley's initial assessment noted, Mrs. Blackwood presents an unusual case of moral insanity without accompanying intellectual defect. She reasons clearly and displays extensive knowledge of literature, music, and household management. 47:08, her manners are refined, her speech articulate. Yet she exhibits a complete absence of moral sentiment regarding her treatment of those she considered her property. During their sessions, Eleanor reportedly spoke freely about her crimes, showing neither remorse nor understanding of why others found her actions disturbing. According to Langley's notes, she maintained throughout her confinement that she had merely exercised her property rights in an innovative way. 47:37, in one session, she reportedly told the doctor, "If I purchase a cow, I may work it in the field. I may use it for breeding, or I may slaughter it for meat. No one questions these choices. Why then should different rules apply to two-legged property?" Dr. Langley recorded a particularly disturbing conversation in March 1841. 47:59, when asked if she recognized any difference between enslaved humans and livestock, patient responded, "The only meaningful difference is that the former can perform labor before being processed for consumption. In this respect, they represent a more versatile investment than mere cattle." Patient expressed pride in what she termed her efficient utilization of resources and suggested that other plantations could benefit from her methods. 48:28, most chilling was Eleanor's apparent belief that her approach represented the logical conclusion of the plantation system. Langley noted, "Patient views her actions as merely removing the hypocrisy from slavery." She stated, "Today, all planters consume human lives through overwork, inadequate provision, punishment, or separation of families." 48:50, "I simply acknowledged the consumption instead of disguising it with pretensions of paternalism." Thomas Rankin, Eleanor's overseer and accomplice, attempted to flee but was captured near Vicksburg. He offered a full confession in exchange for leniency, claiming that he had only followed Eleanor's orders out of fear. 49:11, his statement, preserved in court records, described in graphic detail the process by which victims were selected, killed, and processed. He was tried separately and hanged in December 1840, one of the few overseers ever executed for crimes against enslaved people in the antebellum South. In his confession, Rankin revealed that the killings had begun even before Henry Blackwood's death. 49:39, he claimed Eleanor had instructed him to bring a young enslaved man to the kitchen late one night in April 1839, 3 months before Henry died. "She told me Mr. Blackwood had approved the special project, though he was too ill to participate," Rankin stated. "I knew it was a lie, but I needed the position and the extra money she offered." 50:00, Rankin's testimony suggested that Eleanor had developed her plan long before implementing it. She had everything prepared, the knives laid out, the preservation salts, the smoking chips. She knew exactly what she was doing from the first one. Told me she'd studied butchering techniques for years, thinking about how they might apply to different types of stock. 50:23, the fate of the enslaved population of Willowbend became a matter of legal complexity. As Eleanor's property, they were technically part of the estate that would normally transfer to her despite her crimes. However, given the unprecedented nature of the case, the court placed the plantation and its enslaved people under the administration of the county until proper disposition could be determined. 50:49, William Blackwood petitioned the court to transfer ownership of the enslaved people to him, arguing that as Henry's brother, he had a moral, if not legal, claim to the estate. His petition stated, "It is my intention to remove these unfortunate souls from the scene of their suffering and relocate them to my property in Virginia, where they may begin to heal from their ordeal." 51:13, the court granted his request in January 1841. William's decision to relocate rather than free the enslaved people of Willowbend reflects the limitations of even sympathetic whites within the plantation system. His personal correspondence suggests genuine concern for their welfare, yet he remained unable to see beyond the institution of slavery itself. 51:38, in a letter to Judge Lancaster, he wrote, "These people have suffered beyond comprehension. I intend to provide them with decent conditions and humane treatment, as my brother did before his illness. Yet I cannot, as a practical matter, simply free them. They would face destitution and possible re-enslavement under harsher masters." 52:00, historical records suggest William was true to his word. The 1850 census for Albemarle County, Virginia, lists William Blackwood as the owner of a modest farm with 28 enslaved people, many with names matching those from Willowbend's records. While still enslaved, they had escaped the horror of Eleanor's regime. 52:22, Martha, the house servant whose testimony had been crucial to the case, appears in William's household accounts as receiving special consideration. An entry from 1842 notes, provided Martha with private room in the house and light duties only. Her health remains poor since the events at Willowbend, but her spirits improve gradually. 52:44, by 1855, William's records indicate he had granted Martha her freedom and provided her with a small cottage on his property, where she lived until her death in 1867. Eleanor Blackwood remained in the asylum until her death in 1851. Asylum records indicate she never expressed remorse, maintaining until her final days that she had done nothing wrong. 53:10, "They were mine to use as I saw fit," she reportedly told the asylum physician in 1849. "What difference does it make whether they die in my fields or on my table? Their purpose is to sustain my way of life." In the final year of her life, Eleanor apparently became fixated on writing her memoirs, requesting paper and ink from the asylum staff. Dr. 53:30, Langley initially denied these requests, fearing she intended to glorify her crimes. However, he eventually allowed her limited writing materials as part of her treatment, hoping the process might lead to moral reflection. The resulting manuscript, preserved in the asylum records, reveals no such reflection. Instead, Eleanor wrote what amounts to a cookbook and management guide, detailing her methods of selection, preparation, and preservation. 54:01, the document includes recommendations for identifying the most promising specimens at slave auctions and suggestions for dietary regimes to enhance flavor profiles. Dr. Langley confiscated the manuscript after reading the first few pages. His final entry regarding Eleanor, dated April 12, 1851, states, Mrs. 54:24, Blackwood succumbed to pneumonia this morning at 9:17. She remained unrepentant to the end, using her final lucid moments to request that her household management guide be published for the benefit of other planters. I have placed this document under seal to be destroyed upon my death. Some knowledge deserves to be lost to history. 54:47, Dr. Langley's final assessment of Eleanor, written shortly before her death, reveals his struggle to categorize her condition within the limited psychiatric understanding of the time. Mrs. Blackwood presents a type of moral insanity that defies classification. She is neither delusional nor irrational in the conventional sense. 55:08, rather, she exhibits a profound absence of human feeling, combined with an intellectual adherence to the property rights principles upon which the institution of slavery rests. It is as though she has taken the legal fiction that a human being can be property to its most literal and terrible conclusion. Willowbend Plantation was sold at auction, the proceeds divided among Henry Blackwood's relatives. 55:36, the main house was destroyed by fire in 1852 under circumstances the local newspaper called mysterious but not unwelcome. No structure was ever rebuilt on the site. Local law suggested that even enslaved people being transported past the former plantation would become agitated and fearful, as if the land itself had been corrupted. 55:59, a travel account by Frederick Law Olmsted, who journeyed through the South in the 1850s, mentions the abandoned Willowbend property. My guide refused to approach the former Blackwood lands, claiming that haunts resided there. Upon inquiry, I learned that some terrible crime had occurred on the property, though no one would speak of it directly. 56:20, the local people, both white and colored, regard the place with superstitious dread, and the land lies fallow despite its evident fertility. The documentation of the Blackwood case remained largely unknown outside of Adams County until historian Margaret Porter discovered the court records during research for her doctoral dissertation in 1967. 56:44, her initial paper on the case was rejected by 3 academic journals as too disturbing before finally being published in the Journal of Southern Legal History in 1968. One editor's rejection letter preserved in Porter's papers stated, "While your research appears meticulous, the subject matter is simply too sensational and disturbing for academic publication." 57:09, the Blackwood case, if indeed your sources are reliable, represents an extreme aberration that offers little insight into mainstream plantation life or legal history. This dismissal reflected the academic establishment's reluctance to confront the darkest potentialities of the slave system. Porter's paper, titled The Ultimate Property Crime, Cannibalism and Capitalism in the Antebellum South, argued that the Blackwood case, while extreme, illuminated the dehumanizing logic inherent in the institution of slavery. She wrote, "When human beings, 57:47, become legal property, the only remaining moral barrier is the individual conscience of the owner." Eleanor Blackwood simply lacked this final barrier. Porter's work met with significant resistance from established historians of the period. Several prominent scholars dismissed the case as an aberration that offered no meaningful insights into the broader history of the plantation system. 58:14, others questioned the authenticity of the sources, suggesting the story had been sensationalized or even fabricated entirely. In response to these criticisms, Porter arranged for the original court documents, asylum records, and William Blackwood's journal to be photographed and made available to researchers. 58:34, carbon dating and ink analysis confirmed the authenticity of the materials. Gradually, the academic community was forced to acknowledge the reality of the Blackwood case, though many historians continued to treat it as an extreme outlier with little relevance to mainstream plantation history. Dr. Carlton Hayes of Columbia University wrote in his review of Porter's work, "Porter has certainly established the factual basis of this disturbing case." 59:02, yet, one must question her broader interpretive framework. Eleanor Blackwood was clearly a deviant personality whose actions tell us more about individual psychopathology than about the institution of slavery itself. Porter responded to such criticisms in her subsequent book, Property and Personhood in the Antebellum South, 1972. 59:28, to dismiss Eleanor Blackwood as merely a deviant personality is to miss the essential point. The legal and social system of chattel slavery created the conditions in which her particular form of deviance could express itself. In a society that did not classify humans as property, Blackwood's crimes would have been impossible in their specific form. 59:50, what makes the Blackwood case particularly significant is not just the horror of the crimes themselves, but what they reveal about the dehumanizing nature of the institution of slavery. Eleanor Blackwood's actions, while extreme, were the logical extension of a system that defined human beings as property to be bought, sold, worked, and disposed of at the owner's discretion. Dr. 1 hour and 16 seconds, Porter's analysis, now considered groundbreaking, argued that Eleanor Blackwood was not an aberration of the plantation system, but its darkest reflection, a mirror held up to a society that had normalized the ownership of human beings to such an extent that the boundary between person and property had become fatally blurred. 1 hour and 40 seconds, in her later work, Porter discovered additional evidence suggesting Eleanor's case may not have been entirely unique. She uncovered 3 other investigations from Louisiana and Mississippi between 1830 and 1855 involving suspected cannibalism on plantations. None resulted in convictions, and all were quickly suppressed by local authorities concerned about economic and social disruption. 1 hour 1 minute and 8 seconds. While these cases lack the extensive documentation of the Blackwood case, they suggest her crimes may have been the most thoroughly documented example of a horror that occurred more frequently than historical records acknowledge. A case from St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, in 1847 involved allegations that an overseer had killed and consumed enslaved workers on an isolated sugar plantation. 1 hour 1 minute and 33 seconds. The investigation was abandoned when the principal witness, a house servant, died suddenly before testifying. The plantation owner dismissed the overseer but took no further action, and local authorities closed the case. Another incident in Yazoo County, Mississippi, in 1852 began when body parts were discovered in a planter's smokehouse. 1 hour 1 minute and 54 seconds. The investigation ended abruptly when the planter committed suicide, leaving a note that referenced unbearable temptations without specific confession. Local authorities attributed the remains to improper disposal of medical specimens and sealed the records. The psychological profile of Eleanor Blackwood has fascinated modern criminologists and psychiatrists. 1 hour 2 minutes and 20 seconds. Dr. Robert Hare, developer of the psychopathy checklist, reviewed the historical records in 1992 and concluded that Eleanor displayed classic traits of psychopathy. The records describe a woman with superficial charm, grandiose sense of self-worth, pathological lying, manipulative behavior, lack of remorse, callousness, poor behavioral controls, and a failure to accept responsibility for her actions. 1 hour 2 minutes and 49 seconds. What makes the Blackwood case unique is not the psychopathy itself, which is timeless, but the social context that enabled such an individual to express these traits through the institution of slavery. Dr. Catherine Ramsland, forensic psychologist and author of The Human Predator, analyzed Eleanor's case in her 2005 study of female serial killers. 1 hour 3 minutes and 13 seconds. Blackwood's methodical approach, record-keeping, and lack of emotional response are consistent with organized, sadistic killers. What distinguishes her case historically is the social and legal framework that provided both opportunity and a distorted moral justification for her actions. Most serial killers operate outside social norms. 1 hour 3 minutes and 39 seconds. Blackwood operated within a system that, taken to its logical extreme, could accommodate her behavior. In 1962, during road expansion work near the former site of Willowbend, construction workers uncovered a mass grave containing the partial remains of at least 12 individuals. Forensic analysis confirmed these were likely Blackwood's victims, showing evidence of butchery consistent with the methods described in court testimony. 1 hour 4 minutes and 7 seconds. The remains were reinterred in a marked grave in the Natchez City Cemetery, one of the few known burial sites of victims of this type of crime. The simple stone marker reads only, "Unknown persons, victims of Willowbend Plantation, 1839 to 1840. May they rest in peace." For decades, local residents reported that fresh flowers would occasionally appear on the grave, though no one claimed responsibility for placing them. 1 hour 4 minutes and 36 seconds. In 1998, genealogist Harriet Washington identified several living descendants of enslaved people who had survived Willowbend. Through interviews with these families, she discovered that the story had been passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. One descendant, James Carter of Chicago, shared his grandmother's warnings. 1 hour 4 minutes and 57 seconds. She told us about the cannibal mistress when I was a child. I thought it was just a scary story to keep us in line, like the boogeyman. It wasn't until I was an adult that I learned it was based on historical fact. Carter's family history included an account from his great-great-grandmother, who had been a house servant at Willowbend. 1 hour 5 minutes and 18 seconds. She told her children that the mistress selected the strongest, healthiest young men because they had the most meat on their bones. She warned them never to appear too healthy or strong if they were sold, to hunch their shoulders and cough a little. That advice was passed down through generations long after slavery ended. 1 hour 5 minutes and 40 seconds. Another descendant, Marie Jackson of New Orleans, discovered through Washington's research that her ancestor had been purchased by William Blackwood and relocated to Virginia. Family stories had preserved the memory of William as the good master who saved great-grandpa from the devil woman. Jackson reflected, "It's strange to think that being purchased by another enslaver could be seen as salvation, but that shows the extremity of the horror they faced at Willow Bend." 1 hour 6 minutes and 8 seconds, the Blackwood case appears in few history textbooks and is rarely discussed in mainstream accounts of plantation life. Yet it stands as a stark reminder of the true horror of a system that permitted human beings to be bought and sold. As William Blackwood wrote in the final entry of his journal before his death, "I have witnessed the ultimate consequence of our peculiar institution, and I cannot unsee it." 1 hour 6 minutes and 35 seconds, when we declare a person to be property, we plant the seeds of monstrosity that may bloom in ways we cannot imagine. Today, the former site of Willow Bend Plantation is unmarked private land. No historical marker commemorates the atrocities that occurred there. But in archives in Nat Shea and Jackson, the documents remain. 1 hour 6 minutes and 58 seconds, ledgers, testimonies, and court records that bear witness to a chapter of American history that defies comprehension yet demands remembrance. Local folklore suggests the land remains cursed. Farmers who later worked the property reported unusually poor yields and livestock that became inexplicably ill. In the 1920s, a family that attempted to build a home near the former plantation house site abandoned construction after reporting disturbing dreams and a sense of being watched. 1 hour 7 minutes and 29 seconds, these stories likely reflect the psychological impact of the historical knowledge rather than supernatural phenomena, but they demonstrate how deeply the Blackwood case scarred the collective memory of the region. The last living person with a direct connection to the case was Sarah Jenkins, granddaughter of Robert Jenkins, the neighboring planter who had unwittingly dined on human flesh at Willow Bend. 1 hour 7 minutes and 58 seconds, interviewed in 1952 at the age of 94, she recalled, "My grandfather never spoke of it directly, but after the Blackwood woman was arrested, he never ate meat again, not once in the remaining 30 years of his life." Some horrors run too deep for words. In a final tragic postscript to the case, William Blackwood's life after Willow Bend was marked by what his contemporaries described as melancholia. 1 hour 8 minutes and 24 seconds, despite his efforts to provide better conditions for the people he removed from Willow Bend, he was reportedly haunted by his brother's death and the horrors he had witnessed. His correspondence in the years following the trial shows increasing preoccupation with mortality and spiritual redemption. In 1845, William converted to Quakerism and began advocating for gradual emancipation, a radical position in Virginia at that time. 1 hour 8 minutes and 55 seconds, his will, drafted in 1857, provided for the manumission of all enslaved people on his property upon his death and established a fund to assist their relocation to free states or Liberia. He died in 1858, and court records confirmed that his executors fulfilled these provisions despite opposition from neighbors and local authorities. 1 hour 9 minutes and 16 seconds, perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Blackwood case is not what it tells us about one woman's depravity, but what it reveals about a society that created the conditions for such depravity to exist. The legal system that tried Eleanor Blackwood could only conceptualize her crimes as property destruction because it could not acknowledge the humanity of her victims without undermining the entire economic system upon which the society was built. 1 hour 9 minutes and 46 seconds, as we reflect on this history, we must acknowledge that the greatest horrors are not those of supernatural monsters, but of human systems that enable monstrous acts. The story of Eleanor Blackwood and Willow Bend Plantation stands as a dark parable of how institutions that dehumanize others inevitably corrupt those who participate in them, sometimes in ways that exceed our capacity for understanding. 1 hour 10 minutes and 14 seconds, the whispers of those who died at Willow Bend have long since faded. The fields where they worked and died have been reclaimed by nature. But their story remains preserved in fading ink and courthouse archives, a stark reminder that the most terrifying chapters of human history are those that actually happened. In her final scholarly work before her death in 2004, Margaret Porter wrote, "The Blackwood case forces us to confront not just the obvious physical brutality of slavery, but its profound moral and psychological violence, a violence that victimized the 1 hour 10 minutes and 50 seconds, enslaved most directly, but that also distorted the humanity of those who perpetrated and benefited from the system." Eleanor Blackwood may have been a monster, but she was a monster created by and operating within a monstrous system. As you read or listen to this account, Remember that while Eleanor Blackwood and Willowbend Plantation are constructs based on historical patterns, the system that could have made such horrors possible was entirely real. 1 hour 11 minutes and 20 seconds, the true terror lies not in the specifics of this particular narrative, but in knowing that the institutional framework existed that could have allowed such events to occur with only property crimes as the legal consequence. The shadows of this history remain with us. They remind us that systems which deny the fundamental humanity of any person contain within them the seeds of unspeakable horror. 1 hour 11 minutes and 45 seconds, in remembering the darkest chapters of our past, perhaps we can better recognize and resist the dehumanizing impulses that continue to emerge in new forms in our present.